So I've been playing video games for a long time, and I like a good amount of genres. I grew up with various Nintendo games, came to really like Japanese RPGs and visual novels, and I like a lot of online PvP games like mini fighting games, League of Legends, and even some battle royale games. The MMORPG genre is one of the most popular for video game fans, and in theory seemed like something I could like. I mean, having an open world, ability to interact with random people, and having the choice of what to do along with PvP and PvE options means a fun time, right? Unfortunately, not quite for me. While I kinda liked Runescape as an elementary school game to play with friends, I experienced the first thing I came to hate about MMOs, the grind. I am very much anti-grinding in video games. While Runescape grinding just to level up isn't as immediately bad as other modern MMOs, the fact that you basically have to grind all the potential skill options with no story incentive otherwise made it so I lost motivation pretty early to get to a high level, unlike some of my friends, let alone becoming a paid member. When people think of MMORPGs, one of the most influential and biggest ones is World of Warcraft. Remember how I just said the grind for RuneScape was a drag for me? Well, I thought World of Warcraft's grind was even worse. Unlike RuneScape, where it was fairly easy to at least have some level of choice early on, World of Warcraft forces you to do some really boring fetch quests right from the beginning. Some people like the art style of WoW, but I personally never really cared for the presentation. Like, it wasn't bad, just mediocre in almost every way to me. WoW does have an open world, but at least from what I played, it was just a cheap way of making maps bigger, so it just meant more walking to your destination, or next fetch quest, basically. It doesn't help that the very little story presented at the beginning means nothing to me, since I did not play Warcraft 1 through 3, and was not willing to play 3 RTS games just to understand the story of an MMO I may or may not have liked much. What also did not help is, unlike other multiplayer games I tried, friends who wanted me to play didn't really help me get through the boring parts of the early leveling, which is apparently a common thing to do. What's worse is that I'm constantly told that World of Warcraft apparently only starts to get good at max level, and everything else before that is boring-ish. My thought as someone who has played many single-player games is, what kind of game design forces you to play 100 hours of boring grinding just so you can start having fun? This seems like terrible game design to me, but apparently many WoW fans either don't mind this or even like this aspect. I tried WoW at least 3 times, but couldn't get past level 20 or 25 or so. I still to this day do not get how people got through this, and for a while, this game alone killed my interest in other MMOs. As a big fan of Star Wars, I was kinda interested in Star Wars The Old Republic, also known as SWTOR. The best thing about it I can say is that it's a kinda more tolerable version of World of Warcraft. Unlike WoW, where I had almost zero investment in the presentation and setting, I love Star Wars, especially the Jedi, so I was already into that part. SWTOR also had cool things like party members, like in KOTOR, much more voice acting and cutscenes, more personalized story in general, and of course, just being able to be a motherfucking Jedi. Sadly, despite all these things it's had over WoW, it still basically felt like World of Warcraft 1.5, with lots of the same flaws like boring maps, boring fetch quests, and way too much boring filler traveling. I didn't get that far, even when I had friends to play with when the game was still relatively new. There were a few other MMORPGs I barely tried, for example, Ragnarok Online, but I only lightly demoed a private server, so I wasn't really playing the real way. Guild Wars 2 was sold to me as a PvP heavy game with more dynamic combat and interesting jump puzzles, but I had even less interest in its setting and story than World of Warcraft. I think I tried a beta of WildStar, but I think it says something when no one talks about this game anymore. Anyway, I've complained about MMORPGs enough. Let's talk about the main topic of this video, how I converted into a Final Fantasy XIV fan. While I wouldn't say I'm the biggest fan of the Final Fantasy series in general, there are a few games in the series I quite like, including Final Fantasy VI, Final Fantasy IX, and especially Final Fantasy X, one of my all-time favorite games, period. Final Fantasy and MMORPGs seemed like a pretty decent mix of things that could really get me into the genre. Around when Stormblood was the newest expansion, a couple friends and I actually played together for a trial up to level 30 or so, where that alone was a huge upgrading experience for me over other MMOs I tried. While FF14 still had some boring fetch quests similar to other MMOs, I tolerated them better for a few reasons. 1. The maps looked better and had much less boring walking around. 2, the narrative was executed in a way to actually make me kind of care about the fetch quests I was doing, as opposed to other MMOs where they're clearly just excuses to have more filler gameplay. 3. Actually early access fun dungeons. There are 3 dungeons at main story quest level 15, 16, and 17 respectively, and even with relatively limited synced abilities, these 3 dungeons alone are much more fun than any other MMO where I got to at least level 15 through 17. While my friends and I took a break after we got to level 30 in the demo, I came out of the demo somewhat impressed. It gave me hope that I could actually like an MMO someday. Around when Shadowbringers was a fairly new expansion, a couple of those friends and I started over on a new server, and this is where I appreciated this game even more and slowly became a big fan. The ability to play all classes on the same character was the first thing I really appreciated. In any game with classes or multiple characters I could play, I generally like to lightly experiment with all of them or most of them at the level of skill I'm currently at. Sadly, with games like World of Warcraft, you can only have one class per character, so if I wanted to experiment in a game like that, I would basically have to do the exact same long, boring grind at least 5 to 10 times, depending on how many classes I wanted to try out. With FF14, I have the ability to play anything I want as long as I level it up, and can use it for any future solo instance, dungeon, trial, or raid. Final Fantasy XIV story is one of its big selling points, and I can definitely agree on that front. While it does start slow and has moments of mediocre pacing, I actually didn't mind the Realm Reborn story overall too much. Some people say a Realm Reborn story is straight up bad, but honestly, I think starting from around main story quest level 40 is when it gets consistently pretty decent. The plot twist at the end of post-patch A Realm Reborn is when things really ramp up, and clearly when the developers found their stride, since around then, the story has been pretty consistently great. Final Fantasy XIV's music was also consistently way better than any other MMORPG I played. Most MMOs I tried had good enough background music at best, but basically nothing I would listen to on its own. To be fair, the Final Fantasy series in general is praised for its music, but despite FF14's soundtrack barely having anything from Nobuo Uematsu, it's still a very awesome soundtrack, which is quite an accomplishment. I'd even argue this is the best Final Fantasy soundtrack in the series since Final Fantasy X, though I am including the expansion music. One thing that's fairly praised about Final Fantasy XIV is its general community being good. Apparently in some MMOs, if you screw up a dungeon or a fight, it's likely people will flame you really badly or straight up kick you from the party if you're not up to their standards. In Final Fantasy XIV, I've very rarely seen party rage quits, and if people wipe during a dungeon or trial, people are generally willing to calmly explain how to do the mechanics correctly and generally be positive. One cool thing in Final Fantasy XIV that's apparently not common in other MMOs is the concept of synced leveling. Apparently in other MMOs, once you complete a dungeon at your level, you can't do it again unless you start over, or there's some kind of certain current raid tier or 2 that you can repeat over and over just to get gear. In Final Fantasy XIV, there's a system where if you go to a dungeon or trial that's lower than your level, your stats will be scaled down so you're relatively the same strength as someone who's doing that dungeon or trial for the first time. A really cool concept, and since I already think dungeons and trials and raids are super fun in this game as is, being able to help people out or just replay old content for kicks is really nice to do. The ability to play a 4-year-old Savage raid as long as you can use the party finder is super great, though I also use outside sources like a Sync Slayer's Discord as I'm in the Crystal Data Center to help me look for synced parties for older content. I love challenges, so being able to do things that aren't the most current content but are still available to play for real is very appreciated from me. While I generally don't do this, some people like to turn on unrestricted levels, or what people call unsynced parties, for running older Savage trials for loot, blue mage skilled grinding, or just to say they have a harder duty completed without having too much issue. This is a cool way to have even more options for older content. Even though I'm not caught up to the main story, I love to be able to do older extreme trials and Savage raids as I level up. For example, I only recently beat the Kefka Savage raid, and I'm still only going through the Shadowbringers main story quest. Having the option to even play this way is a blessing. While Final Fantasy XIV still does have its flaws, the fact that I'm able to get this far in an MMORPG and still be having a blast is a huge upgrade from my personal disliked experiences overall with previous MMORPGs. As I continue to go through Shadowbringers and Endwalker's main stories, I look forward to how the story ends, as well as being able to experience all the fun, challenging, extreme, savage, and ultimate content, as well as the bazillion other side content that exists. I hope Final Fantasy XIV can be a good guide for other companies to make MMORPGs that would cater more to someone like me. But even if that doesn't happen, at least I can finally say I really like an MMORPG, which to be honest I've been hoping for at least 20 years.